Well, this is totally cool to be here. I can't tell you how cool it is to be here. I gotta say that the only thing that would make this perfect is if my daughter was here. Because my daughter was a graduate of this university, and as Rick indicated, you know, that's how we got the initial contact here. And the whole time I've been walking around today, I keep getting this, you know, text message from my daughter. I can't believe you're there and I'm not there. I can't believe you're there and I'm not there. So I wish my daughter was here to enjoy this. This is so exciting. You got to recognize this is a dream that a lot of us has had for a long time to build this organization. And you know, I'm undaunted by the fact that our numbers are not humongous at this conference. This is a huge step forward for us. My goodness. I mean, we've taken it outside of California. We had an incredible host in Seattle Pacific University. I was so excited about the student presentations, for goodness sakes. I mean, it never occurred to me when we started this, you know, 5, 6 years ago, you know, that someday I would be sitting in a room listening to students from a different university in a faraway place like Seattle doing presentations underneath the NACSPED banner. I mean, this is just amazing to us. So we're just delighted that you guys participated today as well. Well, we're all about talking about, it's all about community. And now I want to continue to contribute to that. You're going to find, though, that my comments might make you a little bit uncomfortable, because I continue to be someone who sees the potential of the church and then sees the church not fulfilling their potential. And so I'm a person who continues to kind of try to be up in the face of the church a little bit and saying, you know, when are you going to step up, baby? When are you going to step up and do what you were called to do relative to be the salt and light, to be Jesus in the world? So that's kind of the basis of where I'm going to go with this. But let me start by saying that, you know, when we think about people with disabilities and we think about what we want for them as special educators, let's begin by thinking as special educators, we tend to think of several different outcomes. One of the outcomes that we think of that we want them to access as adults is employment. You know, as educators, as special educators, we work towards preparing people with the kind of skills that will allow them to be employed so they can make a real wage, or at the very least work in the community under the auspices of supported employment or something else, where as much as possible they can be in the community and experience real lives. That's one of our major foci in any field of human services relative to people with disabilities. The second foci is independent living. As much as possible, we want people to be living in the community among peers, among age peers, just in typical, you know, homes. Many of us can remember the days of institutionalization and the horrors that was. You know, may God allow us to never be there again in America, for goodness sakes. But our goal is to have people have real lives and live in the community. But let's imagine this was my funeral, and you came and, you know, Ben or Nancy or somebody was up here and they were talking about Jeff, and they said, you know, we're going to miss Jeff. You know, the thing about Jeff was the most important thing in his life was his work. All he lived for was his work. You know, he was a professor, and he worked and worked and worked, and all he thought about was his work, and he loved his work. You know, you'd walk out there and say to your friend, you know, that Jeff, he got it all wrong, didn't he? All he's thinking about was his work all the time, right? Or imagine Nancy comes up here and she says, you know, we're going to miss Jeff who died. The most important thing in his life was his house and where he lived. You know, and more than anything else, he was constantly working on his house. Never spent a lot of time with people, but man, his house was pretty sweet. You should have seen his house. It was just the most amazing house you ever saw, right? You'd walk out here and say, you know, gee, Jeff got that all wrong. I mean, what's the most important thing in life? This is not a hard question. As I say to my students, when I snap my fingers, you'll awaken. What's the most important part? Relationships, right? It's all about relationships. The most important thing that we want to facilitate in the lives of people with disabilities is social relationships. Why? Because that's the most important thing in life. Our social relationships with other people, right? I could have the greatest job in the world, and my life would be a waste if it wasn't about people. I could have the greatest possessions, home, etc., and my life would be a waste if it wasn't about people. So why is it that we would think that people with disabilities would not want the same things out of life? Why would we focus on these other kind of things, those of you guys who are special educators, be so focused on these things that really are not the most important things in life? There's a part of me is, you know, I'm a special educator, for you guys who are going to say, you don't know what you're talking about. In a lot of ways, the easiest things to do are employment and independent living. If I want to talk about the things to do, those are the easiest things. So we kind of pick the low-hanging fruit to work on with people with disabilities. The hard part is social relationships. The hard part is getting people to want to be friends with people with disabilities. Okay. So how can we make social relationships happen? Well, once again, I mean, this is the title of our presentation, the title of our conference. It's all about community. The question is, how do we facilitate community? There's a great book that's out there. It's been out for a couple of years by a guy named Hans Reinders. It's about theology and profound disability. And one of the questions he asks all the time is, how can we make people want, or not make people, how can we encourage people to want to be friends with people with disabilities? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand if you've got personal relationships, friendships with people with disabilities, but I'm going to ask you maybe later. So get ready to answer that question. One of the reasons why people with disabilities struggle with social relationships, one of the reasons why is because of the way that disability is constructed, is socially constructed by our society. Now, there are disabilities that are out there, and I'm not trying to minimize disabilities by making the following statement. There are certain disabilities that are very, very difficult for people. They are literally physically suffering. But because the lion's share of disabilities are mild, most people with disabilities, the most difficult aspect of having a disability are the social consequences of their disabilities, not the disability itself. You with me? So if I'm suffering from having Down syndrome, I'm probably not suffering from having Down syndrome. I'm suffering from the way I'm treated because I have Down syndrome. That's what I'm suffering from, if in fact I am suffering. So it's the social consequences of disability which oftentimes are the biggest barriers to people being in community, to people having relationships. So the thing I want to do is to talk about and dance about some of these social consequences, dance with some of these social consequences for a little bit, and then talk about some things we might do relative to these things. Now I could go off and talk about these things for hours, these different social consequences. But I can tell you they were developed by a guy who is he's like a special ed rock star. He's one of my favorite guys in the world. It's a guy named Wolf Wolfensberger. Rick's back there giving me a high five, all right? Dr. Wolf Wolfensberger. And I can tell you that one of the greatest joys of my life is I've had the privilege to know Dr. Wolfensberger and talk to him about some of these issues. But Dr. Wolfensberger, back in the 1970s, wrote a book called Normalization. And normalization kind of rocked the whole human service world back in the day. And basically, here's what he said, and I know he'd cringe if I said it this way, but that's all right. Back in the day, in the 1970s, what he said that rocked the world was that people with disabilities should be treated as normally as possible. That's what he said back in the 1970s that rocked the world. Nowadays, we're like, well, duh. You know, of course they should be treated as normally as possible. We're still not doing it, but we all recognize what it does. In the 80s, he kind of reframed the notion of normalization under a new term, which he calls social role valorization. This article, if you want to find it, from 2000 is by Wolfensberger, is called An Introduction to Social Role Valorization. Well, Wolfensberger's point is that a person is born with a disability, and by virtue of having a disability, they have a bodily impairment. Okay, so let's say, for example, I am born, well, I said Down syndrome. I'm born with Down syndrome. Okay, I actually have this real thing that's called Down syndrome. It's not something subjective. You can look at me, you can look at my facial characteristics, you can do a variety of assessments, and you can come up with the objective conclusion that I have this thing called Down syndrome. Okay? So I have a bodily impairment. Now, as a result of the fact that I have this thing called Down syndrome, I also have what's called a functional impairment. Okay, I have a functional impairment. That is, there are certain things that I might want to do them all day long, but I'm not going to be able to do them because I have a functional impairment. So I'm going to progress in school to a certain point, but then I'm not going to be able to keep up with everybody else because I'm not going to be able to do the math that everybody else does, or I'm not going to be able to read like everybody else does, or potentially even, although some people with Down syndrome are incredibly physically gifted, I may not be able to do physically some of the things that other people are able to do who don't have Down syndrome. Okay? So I have a bodily impairment that results in a functional impairment. Now those things are not subjective. Those are objective kind of facts that I can document that I have these two things. Right? But the thing that Wolfensberger says is that as a result of me having a bodily impairment that results in a functional impairment, there's like this whole societal cascade of negative things that fall out of that happen to me. Those are called social consequences of disability, and they relate to what's called social constructions of disability. And that is that our society, for whatever reason, over the years, and I hate to admit that the Christian church has in some ways contributed to some of these negative social consequences, social constructions of disability. These negative things just kind of fall out of the fact that I have a disability, and they largely relate to the way that I experience life as a person with a disability in society. Let me dance with a couple of these just for a couple of minutes. First of all, by virtue of the fact that I have a disability, I can almost guarantee that I'm going to be relegated to low social status. I can count on it. I can count on it. And if I'm not relegated to so low social status, it's like, wow, boy, he's doing better than I thought he would. Right? I can assume I'm going to get that just by virtue of the fact that I have Down syndrome. I'm going to be low social status. I'm going to be rejected relentlessly. In almost any environment I find myself in, the immediate kind of response of the environment is rejection. Okay? Thank God that's not the way it is in the church. You know. You're laughing, right? So I can even go to a place that claims to represent the Lord Jesus Christ, and I can guarantee you almost 90% of the time you're going to be rejected there even. So by virtue of the fact that I have a disability, I can count on being relentlessly rejected by the social environment. I'm cast into deviancy roles. Wolfensberger goes into a whole variety of different roles, the way that kind of describe people that have developed over history. I'll give you a couple off the top of my head. By virtue of the fact that I have intellectual disability, I can guarantee that I'll be treated like a child the rest of my life. So I'll be cast in the deviant role of a child by virtue of the fact that I have an intellectual disability. So here I stand before you, 54 years old, gray hair, whatever, and if I have an intellectual disability, people are saying, oh, hi, sweetie, how you doing, Or I'm going to a Sunday school class and they're handing me coloring pages and crayons. What the heck is that about, right? By virtue of the fact that I have a disability, you immediately treat me as if I'm a child. I'm not a child. Right? I'm not a child. Or I'm an object of dread. I'm something to be afraid of. I can tell you in my own church, I tell the people of my church, these things that you do are going to come home to roost when I talk to people. But I can tell you in my own church that at one point when we started a ministry that included adults with disabilities, one of the first things I heard from the elders were, will our children be safe? What is that? There's a historic notion about who people with disabilities are, that they're deviant, they're object of dread, etc., etc. And there's other ones you can think of. Am I going to catch it? I got a person with cerebral palsy here. Am I going to catch cerebral palsy if that person's here? Or they're just an object of charity, or so on and so on. I can give you, or an eternal child. I did research recently on social constructions of disability among religious leaders, and I asked religious leaders if people with intellectual disabilities were angels. Something like 25% of them said yes. By virtue of the fact that I have an intellectual disability, people who are theologically trained think I'm an angel. It's crazy. It's crazy. Branding, relationship discontinuity. By virtue of the fact that I have a disability, people are looking to cut out a relationship with me. De-individualization. I'm treated as a group. Imagine if you guys were all living together and I said, okay, well, it's 6 o'clock, everybody go to bed. You say, what the heck are you talking about, 6 o'clock, everybody go to bed? I want to stay up till 7. I wanted to be in bed an hour ago. Right? By virtue of the fact that I have disability, I'm treated in a group manner. I'm brutalized. I'm prenatally diagnosed and aborted, or I'm looking for a way to kind of do the final solution when you're later in your life and you have disabilities. I can count on the fact that by virtue of the fact that I have a disability, I'm going to live in material poverty. I can count on that fact always. And once again, it's a rare individual who escapes material poverty. I can count on the fact that I'm not going to have the typical experiences. Some of you guys, that probably with tears in your eyes, would raise your hand. Some of you guys who are parents of kids with disabilities, and I said to you, how many birthday parties was your child invited to? And you say, my kid never got to go to a birthday party. What the heck is that? Why would a kid grow up never going to a birthday party? There's a woman who's my age, who's a friend of mine, and my wife took her to the first wedding she had ever been to in her life. I've taken 40-year-old men to the first restaurant they've ever been to in their life. Right? By virtue of the fact that I have a disability, why would I waste my money on you taking me to a restaurant? Right? As an aside, one of the things I always do when I'm with severely intellectually disabled friends, I take them out to Starbucks. Because I like what it says to the community that you got these severely intellectual disabled people walking around with a $5 cup of coffee. That says something to the community. Somebody, at least somebody, thinks that these people are worthy of these types of experiences. Exclusion from religion. Now I can tell you, I got to tell you about Wolfensberger. Wolfensberger is not some secular humanist with an axe to grind, and so he's trying to hammer on religion. So, Dr. Wolfensberger is a very devout Catholic himself. And one of the things that he has observed is by virtue of the fact that I have a disability, I can count on the fact that I'll be excluded from any religious group. Any religious group. Now, we're a Christian group, if other religious groups exclude people, nothing I can do about that. But for goodness sakes, if Christians are excluding people virtually on the basis of the fact, solely on the basis of the fact that they have a bodily impairment, what the heck is that about? How did that ever happen? Well, probably because Jesus never interacted with people with disabilities. That's probably what it was. So we never saw Jesus interacting with disabled people, so that kind of confused us on some level. Maybe. Gee whiz, you look at the New Testament, every time you turn around, Jesus is tripping over a disabled person. And yet if you go to a church, you'd think there are no disabled people in the world. Right? People have their life wasted in a whole variety of different ways. Human services. I won't get into a political statement, but the last thing I'm going to do is turn anything over to the government that has to do with my life. Because though I can tell you that human services for people with disabilities are nothing but frustrating for them. People, and I'm a special educator, right? I'm training human service professionals, right? I got people here who tell me about how they need advocates to go to talk to the school district, right? What is that? That's the government, human services, and in order to get a decent human service from the government, I need to have advocates to go with me to get what I have coming to me. There's a school district not too far from me that literally, I was telling some folks earlier, that literally has a program specialist that goes to the IEP meetings, and that person's exclusive role is to not give the parents what they want. So if the parents want this level of service, that person's there to give them this level of service. Why is that? Because if I don't spend this much money on the parent, then I can use it for something else. Scapegoated, California, I don't know if you know, California is having economic problems, but the good news is we know what the solution is. And you know what the solution is to our economic problems? We're spending too much money on disabled people. That's the solution. So what we got to do is cut back on our social services to disabled people in California, and we'll be good. That's what we've been told. That's what we've been told by people in the government. Segregation, by virtue of the fact that I have a disability, you can assume that I'm going to be segregated from everybody else. My dear friend Arthur Seal in the back there, Arthur likes to talk about, and he uses the word very appropriately, about other. I'll look at a person, and I'll see all these characteristics about him, but I'll find the thing that's not right, and then I'll immediately use that as to characterize him, and then I can other him, and now I have no responsibility, or he's something different from me, or something. No freely given relationships. Do you ever think about the fact that community, what is the community for most people with disabilities? Their community is filled with people like us who are paid to be with them. Imagine if your life is filled with people who are paid to be with you, and that's your social network. People who are paid to be with you. One of the things that I've found in trying to be a free agent in the lives of people with disabilities is those people want to regulate me too. Right? And as soon as I get regulated by these state agents, I lose all kinds of stuff. I lose the natural. Right? So your life is not supposed to be filled with people who are just paid to be with you, for goodness sakes. But that, by virtue of the fact that I have a disability, I can count on my life is filled with people who are paid to be with me. Loss of autonomy, that's obvious. And discontinuity with the physical environment in a whole variety of different types of ways. The environment is protected from me, or I'm not given access to the good things in life, or things are taken from me. So if this is the experience, if this is the social consequences of disability, right, then I take this individual with disability and say, it's all about community. Well, here you go. This is your community right here, baby. They ain't never going to get no community. Never going to have any community with the social constructions and the social consequences of disability as described. And once again, I think you would agree. You all could probably think of examples. I could make you raise your hand and say, can you think of examples of this? And you guys would give me examples of this. So these are all things that are put on people with disabilities, and they're entirely subjective. They're not based on a rational thing necessarily. they're subjective in terms of saying these are the experiences that people have when they don't necessarily need to have these experiences. Well, what do we do? Well, the one thing we could do is heal the people with the disabilities. If we could heal them, they wouldn't have their disability anymore, then maybe they'd escape the social consequences, the social constructions of disability. Now, as a Christian who believes in God, can God heal people with disabilities? Absolutely. I unequivocally say yes. Yes, God can choose to heal people with disabilities. I just haven't seen a lot of it in my life. So for whatever reason, in this particular season of our lives, just the season of God's plan for earth, He's not healing, at least that I'm aware of, a lot of people of the types of disabilities that I have seen in my life. I've never seen a person healed of Down syndrome. I've never seen a person healed of autism. So can God do it? Absolutely He can. At the moment, it doesn't appear that that's happening. But there's other kinds of healing that could potentially happen. The biggest piece of healing that needs to happen is what I'm calling social healing. And social healing is that if it's true that the most difficult part of having Down syndrome is that I have to experience the social consequences of Down syndrome, well, why the heck don't I change the social consequences of Down syndrome? Right? If you came to me and I didn't treat you like you were other, and I didn't treat you like you were a child, and I didn't treat you with all these other kinds of negative things, there's a kind of healing I would bring to you. Because I would be removing the most difficult aspect of disability potentially, which are the social constructions, the social aspects, the social negativity of disability, and making it something different. But our society, it's interesting, once again, this Hans Reinders, he makes this comment where he says, so I have a person who's born with Down syndrome, and by virtue of the fact that I have Down syndrome, I'm going to be suffering in the world because of the social consequences of my Down syndrome. Right? So I have Down syndrome, you're all going to treat me badly. What's society's solution? Kill me. Right? Prenatally diagnose and kill me. That's society's solution for socially constructed negative responses to people with disabilities. Now, we shouldn't be there, of course, with the church. We should be fighting these negative social... If people are truly suffering from disabilities, this social thing, and we ought to be fighting against that rather than being a part of it. We are complicit in the negative social constructions that people experience as the Christian church. We're complicit. What we need to do, to begin with, is to change the disability narrative. To change the disability narrative. And what we're doing is changing the way that people talk about disability. Changing the way that people see disability. Right? We want to change the narrative. Well, let me give you an example. Society tells us, even in the Christian church oftentimes, society tells us that disability is due to sin. I can't tell you, I've interacted with so many people. It was particularly true I've been in Africa and interacting with people in Africa, and in Eastern Europe, interacting with people in Eastern Europe. And they will clearly say to me, and where would they learn this other than the church? They've clearly said to me, the reason my child is disabled is because my grandfather was, killing people in the war. I said, what are you talking about? And they say, well, the sins of the fathers are visited to the succeeding generations. Well, where would they learn that? The sins of the father. Somebody told them. Right? Somebody told them the sins of the father are going to the succeeding generations. Or it's due to a lack of faith. I'm sure I don't have to ask you guys how many times people, especially you parents, how many times people, particularly in Christian settings, have come to you and said, if you had sufficient faith, you wouldn't have that disability if you're a person with disabilities. Or if you had sufficient faith, that child could be healed. Well, my response to that is, well, if you had sufficient faith, you could heal. Relative to healing my child with a disability. But what does the Bible say about this stuff? Is there a narrative in the Bible that actually talks about issues like this? Well, let's think about John 9. John 9 is a passage where the disciples are walking around with Jesus, and just to make conversation, they say, hey, how about that blind man over there? Who sinned so he's blind? And Jesus' response is, nobody's sinned. This happened that the glory of God might be seen in his life, and it goes off from there. So there's an aspect of which that we need to glean is that disability is not caused by the sins of the parents. Now, are there things I could do to cause disability in my child? Absolutely. I mean, the one I think of immediately is shaken child, right? Shaken infant syndrome, where I get so angry that I shake my child to the point that they have a disability. That's clearly a cause of disability from my sin. But if I understand sin, if I have a good understanding what sin actually is, and sin was the cause of disability, then all our kids should be disabled. Did you get that? If I understand what sin is, and sin truly is, and my personal sin is truly a cause of disability, all our children should be disabled. And you know, the real reason why I know that sin is not the cause of disability is because neither of my kids have a disability. Because if sin was cause of disability, I promise you my kids would have a disability. So the first thing we need to know is we need to have a narrative that comes back and says, no. Don't give me this stuff about sin's the cause of disability. At least not personal sin. That kind of thing. The second thing is a lack of faith. Oh, you know, if you had sufficient faith, you know, you wouldn't have that disability. You'd either heal yourself or, you know, or other kinds of ways it could be healed. Well, from a biblical perspective, that's actually goofy. Right? Who is the person, who could you arguably say was the person of greatest Christian faith in history? Maybe it was a guy who wrote a lot of the New Testament, a guy named Paul. Now, let me tell you, did Paul have a disability? Well, there's something that goes on in Scripture. It talks about a thorn in his flesh. Some people think it's a variety of different things, particularly related to vision. And so the thing that Paul did was Paul said, Lord, take my disability away. Because he was the greatest man of Christian faith maybe in history, the Lord just said, no worries, Paul, here you go. Your eyes are good again. No, what did the Lord say? He said, my grace is sufficient for you, Paul. Healing is not formulaic with faith. Right? Healing is not formulaic with faith. It's not that I work and I get to a certain level of faith and bam, now I'm going to start shaping this place up around here, baby, because I can do all these miracles because God's hand is forced by my level of faith. God is sovereign. God is sovereign. So when I see a person with a disability, my response is not to say, gee whiz, have you had sufficient faith? My response should be some other things. How about this one? My response should be, look, here's another permutation of the image of God. Right? The thing that we're so doggone, you know, self-impressed, right? That you tell me I'm created in the image of God, you know, I look in the mirror and say, come on, obviously, look, why do you guys look at me? I'm obviously created in the image of God. And then I turn to look at a disabled person and say, gee, I wonder what the image of God is. Right? We all express the image of God. Right? So one thing I would say is, as a new narrative, a replacement narrative, first, that it's not due to sin. Secondly, that faith is not formulaic. And the third thing is that all people are created in the image of God. And so when I see someone with whatever the characteristic is, my immediate response is, wow, look at the nuances of the image of God that I see in this image. Another thing that we learn is that people with disabilities, at least the way I would interpret this passage, are indispensable. In 1 Corinthians 12:22, Paul talks about the body of Christ. What does he say? He says, the parts of the body that seem weaker are indispensable. Okay, it's a metaphor. And the parts of the body is talking about people. And when I think about people that I know who could seem weaker, see, disabled works for me. I think it's the disabled people that seem weaker. And Paul says, well, you know what those people that seem weaker to you? They're indispensable. Indispensable does not mean you can get by without them. Indispensable means that you can't get by without them. And the other thing about it says they seem weaker. Doesn't say they are weaker, he says they seem weaker. Which once again goes to the point that they're bringing something to the equation that is actually very powerful, and I may not know what it is. But it may seem weaker to me, but that person's indispensable. I tell my students all the time, if I don't know what your purpose is, that doesn't mean you don't have a purpose. That means I don't know what your purpose is. Right? But we, and oftentimes in Christianity, look at a person, we don't know what their purpose is, and our assumption is, once again, in our haughtiness, and therefore you don't have a purpose. I go to this passage and say, when anybody that I come in contact with, whatever their characteristics are, my response is to say, wow, this person's indispensable. And in the group that we have at our church, as much as we try oftentimes to bring people with very severe disabilities into our setting, very rarely do we get them. A guy came with profound intellectual disabilities. And when he showed up, I was so excited. I was so excited. Why? We're going to, for the next hour, we're going to have a closer expression of the whole body of Christ than we've ever had before in this church. Right? Because the Bible tells me they're indispensable. You know, and if I said to you, hey, can I have your liver? Like that new movie that's out, right? Can I have your liver? You say, no. I said, why not? Well, because I can't live without it. It's indispensable. Unless you're the church, right? Because then you feel like you can live without the indispensable parts that Christ said, or Paul says are indispensable. I don't need those. I don't need those parts. The way I talk about it is the church was like a child that was meant to run and has never run. We've always limped. And we've gotten used to limping, and so we thought that's the way we're supposed to be. In reality, we're a church that's been meant to run, but we don't have our foot or whatever the other indispensable part is, and so we've never known what it is to truly be the Church of Christ. Well, how could we address some of these social consequences of disability? How could we change the way we do things such that these things were not necessarily the case? I mean, what if a person came to a church and I didn't allow them to be in any kind of thing that reflected low social status? You know, what if they came and I relentlessly accepted them? I'll give you an example. In my church, there was a woman who came to our church who had mental illness. And she was swearing at the other college students. And she was calling up the pastor in the middle of the night threatening sexual harassment. Okay? Well, if we practiced relentless acceptance, my response would be, I wonder what this woman's bringing to this church that we wouldn't have if she wasn't here. You know, what is it that we're going to get? What is it the Lord's going to do in this setting by having this difficult woman here that we would never experience if she had never come here? That's relentless acceptance rather than relentless rejection. No deviancy roles. Adults are adults, they're not children. None of this other kind of stuff. De-individualization. No, I'm not going to treat you all as a group, I'm going to treat you as an individual. My goodness, I'm going to be out there advocating and fighting against abortion of children with Down syndrome with all my might. And I'm also going to make sure that I say to them, and you know what? Come on down here. Once you have that baby with Down syndrome, bring him down here. We got a spot for you. What we're doing right now is, don't abort that baby with Down syndrome. Here I am with my baby with Down syndrome. Well, you know, there's a church down the street that takes people with Down syndrome. You ought to go down that one. This is real stories that I've heard from real people about how you will grow up in a church, you will get married in a church, you've lived your entire life in a church, a child is born with you with a disability, and the church says, you know what, there's a church down the street that works with people like you. And we think that we're the Church of Jesus Christ, for goodness sakes. Who the heck are we? I don't know who we are, but we're not the Church of Jesus Christ, I promise you that. Whoops. We are changing the slide. Let's see if I can fix this. I apologize for my I get a little excited, as you can tell. There we go. Thank you. And so on. So the thing I want to do is, as much as possible, I as the church want to be aware of these negative kinds of things, and then I want to make sure that I'm not participating in them. Or at the very least, I'm diminishing them. Right? Just as an aside, those of you who are involved with disability ministry, you know what disability ministry, more than anything, I've been doing disability ministry for 30 years. My wife and I have been involved with adults with intellectual disabilities at a local church for over 30 years. You know what disability ministry is, I've come to find? It's changing the environment. That's what it is. It's not about the curriculum, although the curriculum's helpful. It's not about Bible memorization. It's not about all this other kind of stuff. 99% of it is changing the environment. And why is that? It's because this is the environment at the local Christian church. And how am I supposed to ever be a part of community if this is my environment at the local Christian church? So one of the greatest things that we need to do in terms of developing change, rewriting this narrative about who people with disabilities are, is to begin with changing ourselves as a Christian church. The title of our conference this weekend was "It's All About Community." All right, well, it's all about community. Well, let's bring it home here a little bit. It's all about community in your personal life. That's where it starts. I'll tell you a story. I did an in-service one time. I tell the story a lot. Some of you might have heard it before. I did an in-service one time for a school district up where I live. And there's maybe 300 teachers in the room, you know. And the first person was going to do something about full inclusion in the schools, and then I was going to do something about data-based instruction, you know, so you could tell which one was going to be the more interesting. So the first lady, she comes up and she's doing, you know, full inclusion in the schools, you know, and we're going to have full inclusion and the children are going to love each other and all this stuff. And everybody's like, oh, this is the most wonderful thing I've ever seen, you know, and you hear what she said, you know, and they're all clapping, whatever. And oh boy, what a wonderful, thank you so much. That was a fabulous presentation. Oh, it's so hard to go on, you know. Well, Dr. McNair is going to come and talk to us about database instruction now. Dr. McNair, you know. And so I walk up there. This is a true story. I walk up there and I said, how many of you people, and 300 special ed teachers in a room, how many of you people interact socially with peers your age with disabilities, you know, in your own personal life? Maybe 10 people raised their hand. I said, don't talk to me about making children do something that you as an expert aren't willing to do. You want everybody else in the world to include and befriend people with disabilities, and you as the experts aren't willing to do it? See, you guys are a bunch of hypocrites. Let me tell you about database construction. But it's exactly where we live. It's exactly where we live. I can't tell you how many professionals in a whole variety of different human service fields that are working with people with disabilities, and they say, that's my job 9 to 5, I'm not going to mess with those people on the weekends. Or other people say, oh, I work for this agency, and they say I can't work with the people with disabilities that I work with on the weekends. You know, well, my response is, well, I didn't realize you work with every disabled person in the world. You know, I'm telling you, there is no way that people with disabilities are ever going to have friendships. No way they're going to ever have community unless the experts are willing to interact with them socially on their own time. It's the only way it's ever going to happen. Right? Because if I'm not an expert, and you are an expert, and I'm looking at your life, and you're never interacting with those people, why should I? You're the one who knows how to do it. You're the one who's an expert in that field. You're not interacting with those people. Why should I do it? What's the first thing you'll say to me if you say you should be interacting with them? Yeah, I don't have any training. Right? And so we walk away and we don't expect anything from anybody because they don't have any training or something. No, no, no. It starts with me, baby. It starts with me. I tell people all the time, you know, I got PhD, wrote articles, all this other kind of stuff. You know what I'm most proud of in my personal life? In my professional life? That my daughter, who went here, or my son, or whatever, they probably don't know the names of 50 adults with intellectual disabilities. And you know why that is? It's because they've been in my home. You want to have community for people with disabilities? Bring them in your doggone home. Make them be a part of your personal life. Now you start to see some community develop in those guys. And then you'll find out how hard it is to have a relationship because of the doggone professionals and the way that they regulate the lives of these people. It's never going to happen until it happens in our personal lives as professionals. So I hope you made you feel uncomfortable. You know, if you walk out of here and you say, gee, I don't have a lot of people in my life, well, doggone, do something about it, for goodness sakes. My son, once again, my son, he has a friend. A lot of my friends who are here from Southern California know this guy. He used to, when he lived at home, he used to take this guy out to Chipotle for lunch, maybe once a month, maybe once every 2 months. When you talk to this man with intellectual disabilities, first thing he always said was, you know, you and your son and I are Chipotle buddies. We go to Chipotle all the time. Now, 75% of his conversation was about his one unpaid friend in his life who took him out for lunch once every 2 months. Do you have the ability to take somebody out for lunch once every 2 months? It's radical, a change you'll make in their life if you will. As I'm saying, we are the experts. Why would anybody do something if you're not willing to do it? You know, if anything, if I see you not doing it and you're an expert, I think, well, gee, he knows something I'm not. I don't know. He's the expert. I'll be able to leave this thing alone. I hang out with these people. And then the last thing I want to say here just real quickly is the notion of evangelism. You know, there's a couple things about evangelism with people with disabilities. Imagine it's your life experience. Those 18 things that are listed there, imagine that's your life experience. Okay, just for a second, imagine, maybe it is for some of you. Imagine that's your life experience. And I came to you and started treating you like a real human being, and interacting with you the kind of way that Rick was saying, you know, as a human being, and not doing all these things that society does, and criticizing society. What do you think the people with disabilities are going to do? They're going to want to be with you. They're going to want to hang around that place. I mean, wouldn't you love if you went to the average person on the street with a disability and you said, you know, something about, you know that church down here, ever go to that church? You know what? I'm not a big Christian guy, but you know what? That church treats me like a human being. I go down there because that's the only place where people treat me like a regular old human being. I got a friend with a severe physical disability, and every time I see him, almost the first thing's out of he's got a very severe physical disability, severe language disability on some level. Every time I see him, but he's intellectually fine. Every time I see him, the first thing he comes out of his mouth and says, why don't people treat me like I'm normal? Why don't people treat me like I'm normal? People with disabilities are struggling. They're dying. They're trying to find a place where someone will treat them like a freaking normal human being. Right? And here we are as the church, and we're not doing jack. We're not doing jack to help these people to be treated like a normal human being. I'll just keep going. Go off on this. Last thing I want to tell you is the story of the Good Samaritan. I've been reading the Good Samaritan lately, and I got a whole new impression of the Good Samaritan. Let me tell you what happened. In one of my classes that I teach, it's like an intro to special ed class. One of the classes that I teach, I have my students go out and interview a pastor, their pastor or whatever. And I have them interview the pastor and ask questions like, if someone with disabilities came down here, would we be ready to serve them? What priority do we place on ministering to people with disabilities? These kinds of questions that pastors love to answer. And you know what the typical answer is from the pastors? They say, we have accessible restrooms. We, have handicap parking places. You know what? We don't discriminate or distinguish between people. We treat all people the same. And if they came down here, we would love them like anyone else. That's what they say. But let me tell you a different version of the Good Samaritan story. Okay? So, you know the Good Samaritan story. Guy gets beat up, he's laying along the side of the road. And he's next to death. He can't do much anything, he's lying there dead. And all these religious leaders go by, and they're just kind of, gee whiz, they walk around the other side because they don't want to get beat up or whatever. Well, here is the way that the current Christian church does the Good Samaritan. So here's a guy laying there dead by the side of the road, dying by the side of the road. And they say, man, you know what, you're in bad shape. You know what? About 2 miles down the road here, pal, there's a church, or there's a hotel. What I want you to do is get your butt down to that hotel. If you get down to that hotel, I'm going to pour oil and wine on your wounds, baby. It's going to be all good. I'm going to pay for someone to take care of you. It's going to be all good. Just all you need to do is go down to that hotel. When you get there, we'll hook you up. Right? This guy has no way in the world of getting to the hotel. There's no way in the world he has to get to the hotel. How's he going to get? He's almost dead. How's he going to get to the hotel? That's the way we do ministry to people with disabilities. Well, if they came down there, we'd serve them. All right, so let's talk about people with intellectual disabilities. If you came to the church, we'd serve you. Well, they don't have any driver's license. You know what's unbelievable? I know people with intellectual disabilities who will ride a bus for 2 hours each way to get to church. Would you be willing to ride a bus for 2 hours each way to go to church? You might be a great Christian, but that would probably challenge your faith to do that. So I say to a person who has no ability to get to a church because they can't have a driver's license, if you got your butt down there, we'd serve you, knowing that he has no ability to get there. Or I take a person with a physical disability, a severe physical disability, and we say, you know what, if you came down there, we'd serve you, knowing they have no ability to get down there. So it's kind of a safe thing to do, right? If you come down there, we'll serve you, because I know you're not going to come. Right? Now let's assume you did have the ability to come. Let's assume you did have the ability to come. You're going to come to a place that represents these same 18 things that I see in the whole world. And I'm going to come there, and I'm going to walk in the door, and I'm going to hope that maybe these people will accept me, right? Because they represent Jesus, right? And what do I find out? I get the same damn treatment that I get in the community. Why would I do that? Why would I subject myself to that? Why would I go down there and allow people to victimize me in the name of the Lord? So they're not coming. They're not going to come. There's no way these people are going to come. It'd be like me saying to this dying guy, go down to a hotel and I'll fix you up. So you know what? We got to do something different. We can't sit back and think we're the doggone field of dreams. Build it and they will come. We got to be the Good Samaritan. We got to go get the person who's hurting and take them to the place where they can find a social healing. We got to go out and do that. As long as we're the church sitting home, we're basically just disobedient. That's basically what we are. One of the verses that's impacted me really a lot recently is this verse from Mark 7. And I didn't pull it. Whenever you're talking about the Bible and you're a special ed professor and you have a theology professor in the room, it's very daunting. Because you feel like you're going to walk out afterwards and he's going to say, man, you got that so balled up. What the heck? Leave the theology to us, all right? You talk about the special ed stuff. So hopefully he won't say that. And if he does, I'm leaving tomorrow, so I won't have to deal with it very often. But there's this passage where it's a story about Corban, which has something to do with money and whatever. But Jesus confronts these people, and he talks about their practices relative to this. And he says, you nullify the word of God by the traditions that you've handed down. And then he says, and you do a lot of things like that. What is the reason why the Christian church can continue on and exclude people with disabilities? It's largely because of our traditions. It's largely because of our traditions. So we, as the Christian church, have exchanged our traditions for the commands of God. Can you imagine if I was going up to be before the Lord and the Lord said, what'd you do with those disabled people? Those ones who answered like Rick was saying, the ones that answer the rhetorical questions and You know, the people with Tourette syndrome who are making these noises, and, you know, the people who are standing up and clapping too long. What'd you do? Well, we didn't really minister to them because they weren't much of a priority. I mean, God's response, oh yeah, no worries, it wasn't a priority for me either. Yeah, that's good. No, Jesus is going to say, you know what, baby? You exchanged the commands of God for the traditions of men. You're so doggone worried about having your worship service be nice and quiet where everybody can worship, because if there's any noise in there, they can't worship. That it's more important for you to have that quiet little worship setting than it is to have people with disabilities in the presence of the Lord worship. And I could go on that. You're more interested in delivering content, right? Because obviously, if I know a lot of Bible passages, that means I'm growing in my faith, right? I can tell you a whole lot of seminary people who are no longer walking with the Lord and end up forgotten more than I know. So faith development is a whole heck of a lot more than knowledge. But we have equated knowledge with faith development in the Christian church. And so if I have somebody who comes along with an intellectual disability and causes me to have difficulty doing faith development, doing knowledge delivery, then I immediately jettison them, because I say that they're occluding my faith development. True story. This is absolutely a true story. I was contacted once by and I don't know what my time is. Tell me to shut up if I'm going too long. Okay.
Oh, I'm teasing.
Almost done. Okay. I'm almost done. Another minute or so. Another minute or so. I was contacted once by a pastor who was back in the East Coast. And he was talking to me about the fact that he had a girl with Down syndrome, a junior high gal with Down syndrome, who was attending the junior high girls' Bible study. And he didn't think it was appropriate for her to be there because he couldn't get through the content he wanted to get to. And my response was, well, you know, when I think about theological content, you know, kind of the apex is the junior high school girls' Bible study. You know, that's where, if I want some heavy-duty theological, that's where I go, to junior high school girls' Bible study. You know? And so I mean, this has nothing to do with, you know, it's kind of like, you know, we got to get rid of this disabled person because we're trying to memorize the Corinthians 13 love passage. Right? You know, seriously. Seriously. Back to that woman in the Bible study who was the college student who was having the problems, who was mentally ill. The thing that my wife and I did was we talked to the pastor, and I mean, the pastor of the church was literally kind of, the pastors were kind of looking to us, because Kathy and I are the disability people in the church, trying to get our permission to kick the person out, right? But Kathy and I came up with the idea. We said, what if you had a Bible study? What if you took the leaders, you know, the leaders of the college group, and you had a Bible study? And this was a Bible study exclusively for this woman with mental illness. And no matter what this woman did with mental illness, she would never be kicked out of the Bible study. So all this was about, you know, accepting this woman as best as you could, you know, doing some Bible study if you can. If you can't, we're all about acceptance of this woman. What do you think? You could do that? And they thought, well, maybe they could do that. Well, think about Bible studies that you've been in. Okay? Think about Bible studies that you've been in. I got a room full of Christian people. I bet you've been in hundreds of Bible studies. If I asked you, what was your Bible study like that you did back in 1982? I don't know the foggiest idea. I promise you, you'd never forget. I promise you, you would never forget the Bible study at the Memphis Home. And not only that, you would probably learn lessons about love that you would never have learned anywhere else in your life like that. But see, we're not willing to do that. Like, because I got content to get through. And so my traditions of man are more important than the commands of God. That's why we do things in the church. Last thing. And this kind of goes along with some of the other things we talked about already. This is my final point. We've heard this passage a million different times in a million different settings. I want you to think about this relative to the way that we as the church interact with people with disabilities. Right? The social constructions, the way that the world does disability is what I've shown you. Right? The way that the church does disability way too often are the things that I would show you. So here's my final kind of warning to you as Christian leaders. Don't conform to the pattern of the world anymore, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what is God's will, His good and perfect will. You know, the thing that breaks my heart on this, I wish the church was more conforming to the patterns of the world at the moment. Think about special ed in public schools. There's a part of me that almost, at the moment, I don't want us to go to inclusive programs in public schools. Don't hear me say that. Please, God forbid, don't hear me say that. But I wish we were at least as inclusive as the public schools were. You know what I mean? So my challenge to you is to go back to your church, to look around at what's going on, to go back to the agents of Christianity that you're involved with and look around at what's going on. These people need community more than anything else. They need community because it's the most important thing. And they need friendship more than anything else because it's the most important thing. So go back there and say, well, how am I as a church, how am I as a Christian exchanging the traditions of man for the commands of God? And be bold about that. And then, you know, in prayer and in trembling before the Lord say, man, don't let me conform anymore to the traditions of the world, to the pattern of the world. Help me to be transformed and help me to see people with disabilities like you see.